In the year 1942, the Solomon Islands were a contested war zone in the heart of the Pacific. The Japanese forces had occupied several strategic islands, including Guadalcanal, with plans to establish airfields and fortifications to resist the advancing Allied forces. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, a seasoned Japanese officer, had been stationed in Guadalcanal for months. He was a disciplined man, believing in order and strategy above all else. However, recently, things had begun to change. The once orderly encampment was filled with whispers and unease. Rumors spread among the soldiers like wildfire. At first, they were dismissed as the figments of exhausted minds, stories of something lurking in the jungles, something massive. Hiroshi had overheard his men talk about disappearances during the night, about soldiers who went into the thick jungle to relieve themselves or set up night watch, only to vanish without a trace. They spoke of Solomon giants, beings who could melt into the shadows of the dense forest, their presence only hinted at by strange noises in the night, heavy footfalls, snapping branches, and low growls that sent shivers down even the bravest soldiers' spines. Hiroshi didn't pay much attention until one day, Private Sato, one of his best scouts, failed to return from a routine patrol. All they found was his rifle, snapped cleanly in half, and a patch of earth torn as if something heavy had been dragged away. There were no footprints, no blood, only a silence that seemed to mock the search parties. The unease in the camp grew. At night, Hiroshi would stand outside his tent, staring into the jungle, the dark silhouettes of trees swaying against the backdrop of a moonlit sky. Every rustle, every whisper of wind felt like something else, something watching. One night, a scream echoed from the northern perimeter. Hiroshi and his men rushed over, only to find Private Yamada missing. The guard on duty, Corporal Ito, had a haunted look in his eyes. It took him, he stammered, unable to articulate what it was. All he could do was point toward the forest. It wasn't long before the soldiers began to fear not just the American forces advancing toward them but the island itself. Some said the spirits of the island were punishing them for their intrusion, others whispered of ancient, monstrous guardians that dwelled within the dark, unexplored parts of Guadalcanal. As the days passed, Hiroshi knew he had to take action. He ordered Lieutenant Nakamura, a no-nonsense officer with a reputation for skepticism, to lead a scouting party deeper into the jungle. Their mission was to find any signs of what was terrorizing the camp. Nakamura reluctantly obeyed, taking 6 men with him. They ventured beyond the perimeter, into the heart of the dense foliage, machetes slicing through vines, eyes darting at every sound. Hours later, Nakamura's group had yet to return. As dusk fell, a single man stumbled back into camp, bloody, bruised, and babbling incoherently. It was Private Fujimoto, his eyes wide with terror. He spoke of a creature covered in hair, at least 4 meters tall, with glowing red eyes that had attacked them. It had taken Nakamura and the others, leaving him barely alive. His voice cracked as he recounted how the giant had moved through the jungle with an unnatural speed, its eyes reflecting the dim light like fiery embers. The camp descended into chaos. Soldiers who once followed orders without question began speaking of evacuation, of retreating before whatever lived in the jungle came for them all. Even Hiroshi found himself doubting the wisdom of their occupation. What kind of enemy were they facing? The Americans were formidable, but at least they were human. This was something else entirely. To maintain order, Hiroshi decided not to report these incidents to his superiors in Tokyo. Instead, he increased the night watches, doubled the patrols, and told his men that they were merely dealing with a group of hostile natives, nothing more. But deep down, he knew that the jungle of Guadalcanal held secrets far more terrifying than any enemy he had faced before. As Hiroshi lay down in his tent that night, listening to the strange noises emanating from the jungle, he wondered if they had awakened something ancient and vengeful. He closed his eyes, hoping for sleep, but instead found himself haunted by the image of glowing red eyes and the screams of his men echoing in his ears. The Solomon giants, whether myth or reality, had declared war, and Hiroshi knew that their fight was now on two fronts, against the Americans and against the unseen giants of the jungle. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka's fears were becoming a brutal reality. The American forces had begun their push deeper into Guadalcanal, and the Japanese soldiers found themselves retreating not only from a superior military force but also from something far more inexplicable and terrifying, the giants of the jungle. As the battlefronts shifted, Hiroshi's troops were forced away from their fortified positions on the coast into the interior. The jungle, once a natural barrier to be respected, had become their temporary refuge, but it was also an unforgiving labyrinth. It was here that the giants seemed to thrive, using the terrain as an ally in ways that neither Hiroshi nor his soldiers could comprehend. The reports from his scouts were growing more absurd, and yet there was a chilling consistency to them. The soldiers spoke of hulking figures lurking just beyond sight, monstrous shadows moving between the thick tree trunks. Corporal Ito, the same guard who had seen Private Yamada vanish, returned from a supply mission one night, his face gaunt and drained of color. He described seeing one of the giants up close, an immense, fur-covered creature, with a hunched back and eyes like glowing coals. Ito said it carried a club made from a tree trunk and moved with a purpose that was unmistakably intelligent. "It was watching us, Captain," Ito whispered, voice trembling. "Like it knew we were intruding." The Japanese lines were crumbling. During the day, they fought fierce skirmishes with the American Marines, but at night, they faced an enemy against which they had no defense. The giants attacked under the cover of darkness, striking at their weakest points. Entire squads would go missing, their posts found deserted in the mornings with signs of struggle, shattered rifles, enormous footprints in the mud, and the occasional trail of blood leading deeper into the forest. It was as if the island itself had risen to fight them. Hiroshi knew he needed to keep morale from disintegrating completely. He organized night patrols of 5 men each, armed with torches and grenades. He assured them that they were just fighting guerrillas, perhaps some remnant of the native resistance that had never been fully subdued. But deep down, Hiroshi felt the weight of a lie that was becoming harder to uphold with every passing day. His men were no longer fighting for victory, they were fighting for survival. One night, Hiroshi decided to join one of the patrols himself. He couldn't ignore the fear gripping his camp, and he needed to see for himself what they were facing. The patrol moved cautiously, each man on high alert, the thick foliage muffling their footsteps. The air was damp, and the humidity made every breath a labor. They swept their flashlights across the underbrush, the beams flickering like fragile defenses against the shadows that seemed to close in around them. Suddenly, a noise, a deep, guttural growl, echoed through the jungle. The patrol stopped, hearts pounding, as the growl was followed by a rustling in the leaves. Hiroshi turned, his flashlight catching something in the darkness, 2 glowing red orbs, staring back at him. His breath caught in his throat as the rest of the creature came into view. It was massive, towering over them, its body covered in coarse black hair. Its eyes, burning with an unnatural red light, locked onto the patrol. "Fire!" Hiroshi yelled, the order coming out as a strangled cry. The soldiers opened fire, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the jungle. The giant let out a deafening roar, the bullets seeming to do little more than anger it. With terrifying speed, the creature swung its club, striking one of the men and sending him crashing into a tree with a sickening thud. Hiroshi threw a grenade, and the explosion tore through the underbrush, filling the air with smoke and debris. In the chaos, the creature vanished into the darkness, its footsteps fading as quickly as they had approached. 2 men were dead, their bodies lying twisted and broken among the ferns. The remaining soldiers, wide-eyed and shaken, looked to Hiroshi for guidance, but he had none to offer. What kind of enemy could withstand bullets and disappear so effortlessly into the night? When they returned to camp, the men were too shaken to speak. The other soldiers, seeing their haunted faces and the empty spaces where their comrades should have been, knew what had happened. It was the giants. The jungle was alive, and it wanted them gone. The next day, American shelling forced the Japanese to retreat even deeper into the jungle. Hiroshi's unit moved with haste, the sounds of artillery echoing behind them. As they marched, Hiroshi noticed the locals they occasionally saw in the distance, the few villagers who hadn't fled inland at the start of the occupation. They moved swiftly and silently, avoiding eye contact. Hiroshi approached one older man, a villager with weathered skin and eyes that spoke of years spent surviving in this harsh landscape. Hiroshi asked, through an interpreter, about the giants. The villager looked at him for a long time before finally speaking, his voice low and wary. "The giants are real," he said. "They are the guardians of this land, the spirits of our ancestors. They do not take kindly to those who disturb their peace." He pointed towards the distant mountains, shrouded in mist. "They live there, in the caves. You have angered them by coming here." Hiroshi knew that this wasn't a superstition he could dismiss. There was a chilling truth to the villager's words, a truth that explained the disappearance of his men, the monstrous figures that haunted the night. And yet, he had no choice but to continue. The Americans were pushing, and Tokyo's orders were clear: hold Guadalcanal at any cost. That night, as the soldiers dug in, preparing for another assault by the Marines, Hiroshi found himself staring at the jungle once again. The rustle of the leaves, the distant calls of nocturnal animals, it all felt different now. It wasn't just the Americans they had to fear, it was something ancient, something that had called these islands home long before any soldier had set foot on them. Suddenly, a cry rang out from the perimeter. Hiroshi grabbed his rifle and ran, his heart pounding. He reached the edge of the camp to find a scene of devastation, another group of men gone, their supplies scattered, and those enormous footprints leading away into the blackness of the jungle. Hiroshi knew then that the war on Guadalcanal was not just a battle for territory. It was a battle for survival against forces beyond their understanding. The jungle was no longer just a setting, it was a character, alive and vengeful, and it had decided that the invaders would pay for every step they took on this sacred land. As the days passed, Captain Hiroshi Tanaka found himself increasingly consumed by the mystery of the giants. The Japanese forces were being squeezed from both sides, the advancing Americans and the unseen giants, who struck with terrifying precision, dragging soldiers away in the dark and leaving their morale shattered. Hiroshi realized he needed to understand what they were truly up against. The jungle held its secrets, and he hoped the locals might reveal them. One afternoon, under the blazing tropical sun, Hiroshi gathered what remained of his unit and approached a small village on the outskirts of their occupied territory. This village was home to people who had lived on Guadalcanal for generations, long before any foreign army had arrived. Hiroshi hoped they could offer some insight into the giants. Accompanied by Sergeant Fujimoto, the sole survivor from the disastrous scouting mission, and an interpreter, Hiroshi approached an elder, a man named Tamasi. Tamasi had a solemn look, his eyes sharp as if they could see right through Hiroshi. Through the interpreter, Hiroshi asked about the creatures his men had encountered. Tamasi remained silent for a moment, studying the Japanese officer. Then, slowly, he began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "The giants have always been here," Tamasi said, gesturing toward the dense forest and the distant mist-covered mountains. "They live in the deepest parts of the jungle, in the caves high above the valleys. We call them the Ramo, the Ancient Ones. They are as much a part of this island as the trees and the rivers. My people know not to disturb them, for they are the true guardians of this land." Hiroshi frowned. "Guardians? You mean they protect the island?" Tamasi nodded. "Yes, but not in the way you think. They are not benevolent spirits. They protect their territory fiercely, and they do not take kindly to those who bring war and destruction. The Ramo have lived in the forests for longer than we can remember. They are cannibals, fierce and untamed, and they see any intruder as prey." The words hit Hiroshi like a blow. Cannibals. The disappearances of his men, the trails of blood leading into the jungle, the scattered bones found in remote clearings, it all began to make a grim kind of sense. But what troubled him most was the realization that this wasn't just folklore. The fear in Tamasi's eyes was real, and his voice shook as he spoke of the giants. Hiroshi asked, "Have your people ever fought them? Driven them away?" Tamasi shook his head. "We cannot fight them. They are too strong, too cunning. In the past, we tried, but it only brought more suffering. We learned to coexist, to respect their boundaries. When the missionaries came, some of our people moved to the coast, away from the forests, hoping to escape the giants' reach. But the Ramo do not forget. They watch. They wait. And now, with all the noise and chaos your people have brought, they are awake and angry." The mention of the missionaries piqued Hiroshi's interest. Missionaries? What did they think of the giants? Tamasi's expression turned bitter. The missionaries called them demons, the work of the devil. They thought they could banish them with prayers and blessings. Some of them even tried to venture into the jungle, to confront the giants. None of them returned. The Ramo are not demons, they are something older, something that has survived here long after everything else has changed. Hiroshi listened, his unease growing with every word. There was something about Tamasi's tone, an acceptance of the giant's existence as an unchangeable part of life on the island. He realized that this was not a matter of superstition or myth. The giants were real, and they were fighting a war of their own, a war to protect their territory against both the Japanese and the Americans. Later that day, as the soldiers regrouped, Hiroshi called a meeting with his officers. He knew they needed a plan, not just against the Americans but against the giants as well. "We cannot defeat them with force," he admitted. "Our bullets are useless. But perhaps we can avoid them. We must change our strategy, avoid their territory, move through the areas the villagers say are safer." Lieutenant Nakamura's replacement, a young and ambitious officer named Ishikawa, seemed skeptical. "Captain, how do we know these villagers are telling the truth? They could be trying to lead us into a trap." Hiroshi shook his head. "I saw the fear in their eyes, Ishikawa. They fear these giants as much as we do. They have no reason to lie. If we don't follow their advice, we will lose more men, and we cannot afford that." But the plan was easier said than done. The jungle was vast, and the boundaries of the giants' territory were unclear. The soldiers moved cautiously, keeping to paths suggested by the villagers, but the sense of dread remained. Each night, as darkness fell, the men huddled closer together, their eyes darting at every rustle in the bushes, every branch that snapped under the weight of something unseen. One night, as they camped near a cluster of limestone caves, Hiroshi heard a story from Sergeant Fujimoto. They were sitting around a small fire, the flames flickering in the humid night air. Fujimoto spoke in a low voice, his eyes distant as he recounted what a villager had told him earlier. "There was a woman named Mango," Fujimoto began, his voice almost drowned out by the noises of the jungle. "She disappeared from her village 25 years ago. Everyone thought she had died, that the giants had taken her. But she returned, out of nowhere, last year. She claimed she had been taken by the giants and forced to live among them. She said they made her their wife." Hiroshi shivered despite the heat. "What happened to her?" Fujimoto shrugged. "She never spoke much after that. The villagers said she was different, like a part of her had never come back. She was afraid of the dark, afraid of the forest. Some say she still hears their voices calling to her." The story haunted Hiroshi, and he found it hard to sleep that night. The giants were not just creatures of brute strength, they were intelligent, cunning, and capable of something far worse than simple violence. They could take people, bend their will, and leave them forever changed. As dawn broke over the jungle, Hiroshi stood at the edge of the camp, watching the sun rise over the distant mountains. He knew they were standing on the edge of something far beyond their understanding, a confrontation not just with an enemy force, but with the very soul of the island. Guadalcanal was not theirs to take. It belonged to the giants, the Remo, and they had trespassed too deeply into their domain. From then on, the strategy was survival. The men moved silently, avoiding the areas near caves, avoiding loud noises that might draw attention. But still, the giants watched. Hiroshi could feel it, a presence just beyond sight, a weight that pressed down on the camp at night. No matter how carefully they moved, the Remo were there, reminding them of their place. They were invaders, and the jungle itself had risen to make them pay. Hiroshi couldn't help but wonder about the Americans. Did they know what they were up against? Were they too facing these giants, or was this something reserved for the Japanese, as if the island knew who had disturbed its peace first? The thought gnawed at him, a realization that perhaps they were not just losing a battle against an enemy army, but against something far more ancient, far more powerful, and far more unforgiving. The next morning, they found another set of enormous footprints just beyond their camp, leading away into the jungle. They were fresh, and Hiroshi realized that the giants had been closer than any of them had realized, watching, waiting, perhaps deciding when to strike again. It was no longer a war of men against men. It was a war against the spirits of the land, a war that Hiroshi knew they could not win. Years later, the war was long over, and the memories of the battles on Guadalcanal had begun to fade into history. But the tales of the giants, the mysterious Remo, lived on among the islanders and within the darker, more secretive archives of those who had served. It was in 1995 when Nicholas Cox, an ambitious archaeologist with a fascination for untold stories and unexplored mysteries, first heard about the giants of the Solomon Islands. Cox had come to the Solomon Islands to document and explore the remnants of Japanese fortifications that had been abandoned after World War II. He had read the accounts of battles, studied the troop movements, and traced the paths of both the Japanese and American forces as they fought for control of this vital island. But it was in a local market, while speaking with an elderly merchant, that he first heard about the giants, the Remo that the Japanese soldiers had supposedly faced. The merchant, a woman named Lonnie, spoke of the Remo as if they were still present. "They live in the mountains, in the deepest caves," she said, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the horizon. "They are still there, watching. They do not come out often, but we know they are there." My grandfather used to say they are why the Japanese lost their minds, why they fled into the jungle and never returned. Cox was intrigued. He had heard many local myths during his travels, but there was something about the way Lonnie spoke, a conviction, a fear, that struck him deeply. He decided to dig deeper, not just into the old Japanese bunkers but into the stories that seemed to bind the island's past to its present. One of his guides, a man named Samuel, took him to some of the more remote areas of Guadalcanal. It was here, in the dense jungles far away from any village, that Cox began to see the remnants of something strange. Samuel pointed out unusual markings on the trees, large gouges that seemed far too big to have been made by any known animal. Then there were the stories, whispered tales of disappearances even in recent years, of people wandering too far from their villages and never coming back. One particular story caught Cox's attention. It was about a woman named Mango, who had disappeared from her village for 25 years and then returned unexpectedly. Samuel took him to the village where she had lived, now a place mostly inhabited by her relatives. They were reluctant to speak of her, and even more reluctant to share the story of where she had been. She came back, but she was never the same, one of her nieces finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She spoke of giants, of being taken as their wife. She said they were cruel, that they kept her in their caves and watched her every move. When she returned, it was like she had left a part of herself behind. Her eyes were hollow, her spirit broken. Cox felt a chill run down his spine. The idea of being taken, of being forced to live among these giants, seemed to confirm the stories he had heard from World War II veterans who had served in Guadalcanal, stories of entire patrols vanishing, of soldiers found dead in the forest with expressions of pure terror frozen on their faces. Determined to learn more, Cox pressed on with his explorations. His team set up camp near an old gold mine in the central part of Guadalcanal, a site where recent activity had left the area somewhat cleared and accessible. There had been reports of miners experiencing strange events, enormous footprints found near the equipment, tools and even machinery moved in the night, as if a colossal force had casually shifted them aside. One night, as Cox and his team sat around their campfire, the foreman of the mining site, a grizzled Australian named Barry, shared his experience. "We had just set up the new hydraulic excavator," Barry began, his voice rough from years of smoking. "It was positioned to start digging at dawn. That night, I heard something, a deep rumble, like a growl, followed by a loud crash. I rushed out of my tent, and there it was, the excavator, tipped over, like a toy thrown by a tantrum-throwing child. And right there, next to it, in the mud, were those footprints. Bloody hell, I'd swear they were the size of a small car." Cox felt the unease grow within him. He had seen those footprints earlier, too, deep impressions in the wet earth, each nearly 3 feet long, with toes that looked almost human. They were fresh, and the dirt around them had been churned up as if whatever had left them had moved with incredible strength and speed. He decided to follow the trail the next morning, armed with nothing but his camera and a sense of determination. Samuel, along with 2 other guides, led the way, their machetes cutting through the dense foliage. As they climbed higher into the hills, the jungle became thicker, darker. The air was heavy, and every rustle seemed to echo with a hidden threat. After hours of trekking, they came to the entrance of a cave, its opening large enough to admit a small vehicle. The air around it was cold, and an unnatural silence hung over the place. Samuel hesitated, refusing to go further. "This is their home," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We do not enter. Not if we value our lives." But Cox was undeterred. He entered the cave alone, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deeply into the stone, symbols that seemed almost primitive, yet deliberate. He took photographs, his camera's flash briefly lighting the cavern, revealing massive stalactites and a floor scattered with bones. Human bones. Cox's breath caught in his throat. Some were old, cracked and yellowed with age, while others seemed disturbingly recent. Then he heard it, a deep rumbling, like a growl reverberating through the stone. The ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet, and suddenly, the reality of his situation hit him. He was alone, in the lair of something that the islanders feared deeply, something that had terrorized both the Japanese and now the miners decades later. Cox turned and fled, his flashlight bobbing wildly as he sprinted out of the cave, his heart pounding in his ears. Back at camp, Cox tried to rationalize what he had seen, but the image of those bones and the rumbling in the dark left him shaken. He knew that what he had found was proof that the giants, the Remo, were not just myths or wartime hallucinations. They were real, and they were still there, hidden in the untouched parts of the island, watching, waiting. Samuel, seeing the state Cox was in, said quietly, "The Remo do not want to be found. They are angry because we have disturbed their home, their peace. If you value your life, you will leave." Cox knew Samuel was right. There was something about the island, something that resisted exploration and exploitation. The Remo were a part of it, a living reminder that some places were not meant to be tamed or understood. They were guardians, not in the benevolent sense, but as fierce protectors of a land that had never belonged to outsiders. The stories of the Japanese soldiers, the missing villagers, the miners, they all pointed to the same truth. The giants were real, and they were the final line of defense for an island that had endured war, occupation, and invasion. As Cox prepared to leave Guadalcanal, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was the same feeling Hiroshi must have felt decades earlier, the sense that the jungle itself was alive and aware. He realized that he had found what he was looking for, not just the remnants of war, but the living history of the island, a history written in the shadows of the forest and in the legends of the Remo. And as his boat departed from the shore, Cox glanced back at the towering peaks of Guadalcanal, shrouded in mist and mystery. He knew that the giants were still there, hidden but ever present, a part of the island that would never be conquered, only respected, or feared. Nicholas Cox had returned from Guadalcanal with more questions than answers. The photographs, the bones, and the stories of the islanders were all proof, yet not the kind of proof that could be easily documented in scientific journals or presented at academic conferences. What he had encountered was far beyond the realm of rational explanation. It belonged to the intersection of myth and reality, where logic dissolved and ancient fears took over. Back in Sydney, Cox spent months sifting through his notes, photographs, and recordings. He interviewed veterans who had served on Guadalcanal and pored over Japanese records from the war. The accounts were consistent: a mysterious enemy in the jungle, attacking under the cover of darkness, taking soldiers away without a trace. Yet, even with all this evidence, Cox found it difficult to convince his colleagues of what he had seen. Most dismissed the stories as exaggerations or wartime hallucinations born of stress and fear. However, there were others who listened. Among them was Dr. Helen Cartwright, an anthropologist specializing in Pacific Island cultures. She had spent years studying the myths of the region, stories of giants, spirits, and the supernatural. When Cox showed her his photographs and described the cave, she nodded thoughtfully. "The Remo are not just creatures of myth," she said. "They are part of the land, as much as the mountains or the rivers. They are what the islanders use to explain the unexplainable, the power of the jungle, the forces that resist colonization and control." Cartwright explained that there were similar stories throughout the Pacific. The Solomon Islands had their giants, the Ramo, while Australia had the Yowie, and North America had Bigfoot. She suggested that these creatures might share a common origin, a relic species that had somehow survived in the most remote, untouched places on Earth. Perhaps, she said, these giants are a kind of resistance, not just to war and modernity, but to the idea that everything in the world can be known, measured, and tamed. Cox found her perspective fascinating. It offered an explanation that was both mystical and scientific, but it also left much unanswered. Were the Ramo truly guardians, or were they simply territorial predators, reacting to intruders like any other animal might? Were they a lost branch of humanity, something that had evolved in isolation? Or were they, as some claimed, not of this earth at all? As Cox and Cartwright continued their research, they came across another intriguing possibility. The local islanders also spoke of a smaller, more elusive creature, the Kakamora. Described as small, shy beings who lived in the mountains and forests, the Kakamora were less aggressive than the Ramo, often depicted in stories as tricksters who avoided direct contact with humans. Cartwright speculated that the stories of the Kakamora and the Ramo could be related, with one being a distorted version of the other, the Ramo representing the dark, frightening aspect of the jungle, and the Kakamora the more playful and mysterious. Cox became increasingly convinced that what the soldiers had faced during the war was a combination of fear, exhaustion, and a very real, very dangerous presence in the jungle. He theorized that the Japanese soldiers, already under immense stress from the American assault, had encountered the Ramo and interpreted their aggression as an outright attack. The fact that the giants seemed to appear mostly at night, striking without warning, only fed into the terror. One piece of evidence stood out: the lack of resistance from the Japanese forces when the Americans landed at Guadalcanal. Cox had found accounts suggesting that, in certain sectors, the Japanese had abandoned their posts without any fight, leaving behind artillery, ammunition, and supplies. There were stories of entire squads retreating into the jungle, only to vanish without a trace. It was as if something had frightened them more than the advancing Marines. Dr. Cartwright proposed a final, chilling hypothesis. Perhaps the Ramo saw themselves as protectors of the land, not in a benevolent sense, but as territorial guardians. They didn't distinguish between Japanese or American, invader or ally. To them, all outsiders were intruders, and the jungle was theirs alone. It explained why both the Japanese and even later explorers like Cox had felt that same presence, the sense of being watched, the feeling that something ancient and powerful lurked just out of sight. In the years that followed, Cox published his findings, but they were met with skepticism. Many of his peers argued that he had been influenced by the local stories, that he had let myth cloud his judgment. But there were others, soldiers, islanders, and even scientists with open minds, who believed him, who saw in his photographs and his trembling voice the unmistakable mark of someone who had come too close to the unknown. Cox himself decided never to return to Guadalcanal. The island had taken something from him, a certainty about the world that he could never recover. The jungle, with its towering trees and impenetrable darkness, held secrets that were not meant to be uncovered. And the Ramo, the giants who guarded that sacred place, were a reminder that some places were never meant to be conquered. There were rumors in the years that followed, rumors that occasionally reached Cox's ears. Stories of miners who had gone missing, of strange lights seen in the mountains, of an entire logging operation abandoned after workers reported seeing monstrous figures moving through the mist at dawn. The Solomon Islands, despite modernization and development, remained a place of deep mystery, a land that resisted the push of the modern world. For the local people, the Ramo were still part of their lives. The villagers taught their children to respect the boundaries of the jungle, to never wander too far, especially at night. They spoke of the giants in hushed tones, as if speaking their name too loudly might draw them out of the shadows. The story of Mango, the woman who had returned after years with the giants, was still told, a warning and a reminder of what lurked beyond the familiar paths. In the end, Cox understood what the islanders had always known: the Remo were not just giants of legend, they were the guardians of a world that existed beyond the reach of men like him, a world that belonged to the past, to the land, and to the shadows of the untamed jungle. They were there long before the first soldier set foot on Guadalcanal, and they would be there long after the last human left. And so, the giants of the Solomon Islands remain, a mystery, a warning, and a symbol of the enduring power of nature against those who seek to dominate it. Whether they are seen as protectors or predators, one thing is certain: they are part of the island, as much as the trees, the rivers, and the mountains. And as long as the jungle stands, so too will the giants, hidden and watching, a reminder of the thin line between legend and reality.